How to Sew the Charming Weekender by Amber Makes. This is a lovely weekend bag that you can make in any charm squares. I've made mine in Portuguese tiles. Follow me and I'll show you how to make it. Cutting out. The instructions tell you exactly what you need. You'll need a pile of charm squares or fabric cut to that size. You'll need some fabric for the lining and the pockets and the handles. I've used 3 different prints here. Again, the instructions will give you the measurements for these. You'll need 2 zips, one for the bag. I've used a double slider zip, but you could just use a single slider, and you'll need a zip for the pocket. Again, measurements in the instructions. You'll need some wadding if you want to give it some structure. I've used H640. You could use bows or foam interfacing if you prefer, and some webbing to put into the handles, but again, that's optional. And some little press fasteners or cam snaps to hold the shoulder pad closed. So once you've gathered together everything you need to start off by making the bag end template. Trace this from the instructions. We've just given you a quarter of the template. Now draw a square onto a piece of paper. I've used freezer paper here only because it's easier to press onto the fabric. If you draw 2 lines, make sure they're right angles, about 14 inches long. Place 1/4 of the template so that the straight lines match at the centre, and then trace round it. Then that's 1/4 done. And then to do the other 3/4, which I've already done, you just turn that template around and just keep tracing around it. And then cut round this. This is your whole template. You can use tracing paper for this, greaseproof paper. But if you do have freezer paper, it means that because it's got a waxy finish to one side that doesn't mark, you can press this onto your fabric and then cut round it. And it also means that your template's a bit more stable. And if you want to make this bag again, you've got a more permanent template. So you'll be using this to cut out the lining, and you'll also be using it to cut out the out of the bag ends once you've done all of the quilting and assembly. But I'll explain all of that in the video, and it's in the instructions as you go along. You could label this template, and then if you want to use it later, you won't forget what it is. So now your bag end template is finished. You can cut out the other fabric. So I've arranged them. You need charm squares for the front outer and the back outer. Put those into a pile. You'll need some for the bag ends. And you'll need one for the shoulder pad outer lining. The instructions tell you how many and how to choose them. The lining fabric you'll need to cut. So you'll need some lining for the main bag. I've used 1 colour for this. You can use all the same colour for your lining, but I've just chosen to use it different colours. Use your template to cut out the 2 bag end lining pieces by either pinning it on and cutting around it, or if you've used freezer paper, you can press it on. You'll need some fabric for the handles. I've used a different fabric, coloured fabric, but again, you can use the same colour as the lining if you like. You'll need some pieces for the zip tab ends, and then you'll need 2 pieces for the pockets. So everything's cut out and ready to go. Making the outer pieces. The charm squares need to be sewn together to form patchwork. So place the charm squares that you've put to one side for the bag front outer and place them up so they're in 5 rows with 5 squares in each row. Make sure you alternate the prints so the same ones aren't touching. And then sew all of the pieces together in each row. You may find it easier if you label the rows, because then you can just label row 1 and then sew all those pieces together in row 1 in a horizontal line, and then sew row 2, row 3, row 4 and row 5 together, and it will look like this. And then you need to sew all of the rows together, one below the other. Make sure you match the seams. So what I did is I pressed the seams to one side, but pressed them in opposite directions. So the ones in row 1 I pressed to one side and the ones in row 2 to the other. It just helps when you're seam matching because you can nest those seams. Pin them together all the way along. Make sure you pin them together at the seams first and then pin between, and then you can make sure your seams are matching. If they don't match perfectly, it doesn't really matter because it's a patchwork bag, but if you just try and get them so they match at this stage, then you will get a slightly neater finish. And then pin them together at the end, and then sew that together, and then sew row 3 below row 2, row 4 below row 3, and row 5 below row 4. And then it will look like this, and this is your rectangle that's for the bag front outer. And you can see with those I press the seams open just because there's a lot of bulk in those corners. Repeat that to make the bag back outer in exactly the same way. Again, arrange your prints so that they're in whatever arrangement you want, but try to make sure the same ones aren't touching. And then for the bag end outers, you need to join together 9 squares in whatever arrangement. I've put more of a feature charm square in the centre because this is going to be cut into a circle, and I just did that so to give it a more pleasing effect, but that's up to you. Now, if you want to add some padding to your bag, take some wadding. I'm using an H640 wadding here because it's fusible, and press all of those pieces right sides up onto the glue side. If you want a more structured bag, you can use a foam interfacing such as Vlizoline Styleville or Beausoleil Noir form. It will work just as well, but just give you a more structured finish. Or you don't have to add any stabiliser at all. It's entirely up to you, depending on the structure you want of your bag. But if you are using a stabiliser, press them all into place, the front outer, the back outer, and the end outer. If you're not using a fusible stabiliser, then tack them into place all the way round. Now you can also then add any quilting details if you want at this stage. So for the front and the back, I've just quilted around the squares, 1/4 inch either side of the squares, and then diagonally through the squares. But it's entirely up to you what pattern you choose. It doesn't have to be anything complicated. It just gives it a little bit more detail and shape as well. With the ends, use the template to cut them out, making sure that it's central, and then do the quilting. Cut them out in the same way as you did with the lining, so you've now got 2 circular ends. So all your pieces are now quilted and cut to shape. The front outer and the back outer will also need trimming. Making the pocket. There are 2 pieces for the pocket front and the pocket back, and this is sewn to the bag back lining. So take all of those pieces. Now take the pocket front, and on the wrong side, measure 1.5 inches down from the top edge. All of these measurements are in the instructions to remind you. And then draw a line across the fabric to this 1.5 inch measurement. If you use your rotary cutting ruler here, then you can mark up that 1.5 inch line so you make sure it's straight. Then mark another line 1/4 inch below this. If you don't have one of these rulers, then just use a tape measure and mark several points. And then mark another line 1/4 inch below this. So you've got 3 parallel lines spaced 1/4 inch apart. Fold that in half just to find the centre, because these lines need to measure 7 inches in length and they need to be central. So if you mark the centre, and then you mark 3.5 inches to the right of the centre, and 3.5 inches to the left of the centre, and then draw a vertical line at these marks, then your 3 spaced lines are now 7 inches long and they are placed centrally. Also draw little diagonal lines going from the top corner to the centre line on both sides. These are cutting lines. So the centre line is a cutting line and those little lines, and the outer lines are sewing lines. So take your bag back lining and place the pocket right sides down on top. It needs to be central. So if you fold your bag back lining in half and just mark that centre, you can just finger press that crease. Or you can use an iron. Open it out. So this is the right side now, and then place the pocket right sides down on top because you drew on the wrong side of the pocket. Match up the top raw edge and those centre lines. So the pocket front is now right sides facing with the bag back lining, and the marked box is you marked on the wrong side, so that's showing Now pin it together. We're going to sew along the outer line, so place pins on, but place them far enough away from the outer line so that you don't have to remove the pins. It just keeps it all a bit more stable. And sew around the outer marked lines only. And then it will look like this. So I've sewn them together along the outer marked lines. Now we need to cut along that central line. So fold all the fabrics in half just to make a little snip, and then that's got you through all the layers. Open it out again, and cutting through the pocket and the back lining, snip along the centre line, stopping at the end of those little diagonal points, and then cut into the corner. Cut right into the corner, but don't cut the stitching. These little diagonal points help to make the pocket lay flatter. And then working from the centre again, cut along that line and then snip into the corner and then snip into the other corner. Now we're going to post this fabric, so this pocket, inside. To help it to lay flatter, we'll just press it first. So lay it on your ironing board, open up just the pocket section, so you open up those two fabrics. I'm just going to finger press those open because it's a little bit fiddly, and then use your iron, press that seam open. This step helps to keep the seam laying right on the edge, which is important so that the pocket lies on the inside. So do take the time to do this before you post it through. It saves a lot of fiddling later. And then press the bottom one over, and then also those little diagonal sections, press those open as well. Now you can post the pocket through the little post box, the top and the bottom of it, all the way through to the wrong side of the lining. Now place the lining wrong sides up like this, so the pocket's now on the inside, and you just need to adjust it and press it so that those raw edges of the top of the pocket match up with the raw edges of the lining. You can pin those before you press them if you prefer, and then just ease it all. Ease it and press it. So what you're trying to achieve here is that the seam is laying right on the edge. Sometimes I find it easier to give, particularly those edges, to give them a little spray with water and then press them. It sort of relaxes the fabric a bit and helps to remove those creases. Now I've given it a good press, and you can see now that the seam is laying right on the edge. Take your pocket zip. Mine is way longer than I needed just because I only had a long one, but the measurements in the instructions will tell you which. And then place that the zip teeth, right sides up, centrally underneath that little gap. Make sure the slider on the left-hand side is well out of the way. We'll cut that and move that later. But it's easier to pin the zip teeth in, which is why I've listed a longer zip than you need in your instructions. Just adjust it so those zip teeth run centrally through that little opening. And then I like to just, now when I'm happy that they're running centrally, I like to anchor it with a few pins. And this is why I leave the slider outside of the box. It's quite hard to get the teeth central if the slider's inside, because it adds a bit of extra bulk and distorts it slightly. So if you just push pins through the fabric and into your ironing board, that anchors it in place and stops everything shifting when you then start pinning. So once that's all nice and secure, you can then lift the fabric slightly and push all of those pins in. So pin them in reasonably close to the edge, because you're going to be stitching through the fabric and into the zip in a moment. And then turn it round. I always turn it round, or I just walk round to the other side of the ironing board, just because it's easier if you place the pins that they're facing away from where you're sewing. It just makes it simpler for removing them as you reach them when you sew. So pin it into place all the way round. Now we need to move that slider. So I'm just going to pin the zip tape into place because it stops it opening up. And then if you take hold of the end of the slider, you can just give it a little push and push it so it's inside the teeth. That's really important, otherwise your slider will be outside of your pocket. And then you can pin across that end. So now all your zip is in place. You just need to, using a zip foot, stitch all the way around the edge, about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. And then it will look like this. So you've sewn all the way around the edge. Now get rid of the excess zip. Trim the zip so it's about a ½ inch outside of that stitch box. It removes those metal ends and it means it won't be in the pocket seam. And then do the same at the other end. So you've now got the zip inserted, but you now need to make it into a pocket. So take the pocket back, place that right sides facing on top, and then pin it together all the way around. The important thing here is do not pin into the lining, because you don't want this pocket to be seen. It's a secret pocket, and all you'll see is the sewing and the zip, but you don't want to see that. It also will look a bit untidy on your lining, so make sure you just pin the pocket front and the pocket back together, but don't pin into the lining. So pin it together along the bottom and then up the other side. And then once you've done that, sew it together down the side, across the bottom, not the other side, but don't sew into the lining, just sew the pockets. And it will look like this. You can see I've sewn it together, so we just need to secure it along the top. So pin the 3 layers together, the pocket front, the pocket back, and the lining. Make sure the raw edges match up as you're doing this. Just because the zip pulls it a little bit out of shape. And then once you've pinned it, you need to tack it, but tack within the seam allowance. So tack it about 1/8 of an inch from the top, because you don't want to see these stitches later. And then once you've done that, it will look like this. And you've now got a really nice, neatly inserted pocket in your bag back lining. So that's all ready to start lining your bag. Making the handles. So each of the bag handles has a charm square sewn into the centre as a feature. So take the 2 charm squares you've chosen for the bag handles and trim them so they measure 3 × 5 inches. So 3 inches across and 5 inches up. Now take 1 bag handle strip and place 1 short end of your trimmed little charm square, right sides facing, with 1 bag handle strip. And then open that up and take another bag handle strip and sew 1 short end of that right sides facing to the other end. And this will place the charm square in the centre. It adds a little feature to your bag. And sew that into place and the other one into place. And it will look like this. Press those seams open just because you want them nice and flat inside the handle. Now fold the handle in half, right sides facing. Start at the charm square, because it's nice if you get those seams to match, just because it'll be a bit neater. So pin those seams together so that they match, and then pin the other seams together. If you place a pin vertically through those 2 seams and then place that pin diagonally, take that vertical pin out, that just makes sure the seams match. And then pin the rest of the handle right sides facing along the long raw edge. Make sure the raw edges match and pin it together all the way along. You can press it. It sometimes makes it a little bit easier if you press it in half first and then pin it, just because it's quite a long strip. And then pin it all the way along the other side. I'm just going to show you this, I'm not going to do it. And then sew together all the way along. And then take the seam and press it so it's in the centre. So press it open and flat, but so it's laying down the centre. I'm going to use a turning tube to turn it right sides out, so I've tacked it together along one end. So if you're using a turning tube, push the tube through to one end. If you're not using it, if you haven't got a turning tube, then you'll just have to turn it right sides out. It just takes a little bit longer. Push the tube all the way through, and then take the stick and take the flat end and push that through, and then you can push the whole handle right sides out. It's quite a long handle, but it's a neater finish to do it in a tube and turn it right sides out, and it's also less bulky. So push it all the way through, and when you get through to the other end, you can then take the end and pull it through, which is why the turning tubes make it a lot quicker. Now press this handle flat. I just need to remove the tacking stitches from that end. If you've used a turning tube, just take those tacking stitches out from the end. Now press it flat so that that seam runs down the centre of the back edge. It'll be quite creased because you've turned it right sides, so take care to press it all the way. And then it will look like this. So it's nice and flat tube. Now you can just leave them like this, but if you want them to have more structure, take some webbing. The measurements for this are listed in the instructions, and feed the webbing through. I find that the webbing feeds through quite easily. If you're struggling to get it through, you can pop a safety pin on the end, but I find if you lay the handle flat, the webbing is structured enough to be able to just push it through. Now you don't have to use that, but I just find it gives it a bit more structure. The webbing is a little bit longer than you needed, and then I top stitched through the centre of the handle to hold the webbing in place, and then trimmed it at the end. And then once that's done, that's one handle finished, and repeat that to make the other handle in exactly the same way. Attaching the handles. So take your bag front outer right sides up, and remember you've trimmed this to size already following the instructions, so it's exactly the right size. Now measure 4.5 inches in from the left hand side. Now do this again 4.5 inches a few times all the way down the side, because you need to do it all the way down to the bottom. So I measure 4 or 5 times 4.5 inches, because this is the placement for your handles. So if you measure and mark a few times, it just means that the handles will be straight. Now take one of your handles and make sure that you place it right sides up. So the bottom of the handle needs to be, the left-hand side of the bottom of the handle needs to be 4.5 inches from the bottom. And look, you can now follow the left-hand side to make sure it lines up with those pins. And then pin it together in place. You can either pin across or along one side, it's up to you. Do make sure your handle is right sides up. You'll know that because the seam is the wrong side. So that outer edge, so the left-hand edge, needs to be level with the 4.5 inches mark. So I'm going to just pin mine either side, and then pin it at the top as well. So now your handle is positioned 4.5 inches in from the left-hand side of the bag front outer. Now you need to make another measurement now. Measure 4.5 inches down from the top and mark that. Use an erasable pen to mark that, and then mark another line 1.5 inches down from that. So 4.5 inches down from the top, 1.5 inch below. But these measurements are all in the instructions, so you can follow them. Draw a horizontal line at that 4.5 inch mark and another one at the 1.5 inch mark. And that's where you're going to sew the handles into place. Now take the other end of the handle, make sure that it stays straight by running it through your fingers so that you haven't twisted it at all. And in exactly the same way, measure 4.5 inches in from the right hand side of the bag front outer and pop a pin in. And then do that a few times all the way up. It's just to really ensure that the strap stays straight. And then I'm going to measure my 4.5 inches in from the top. And then I'll do another one a bit further down. It's entirely up to you how many measurements. I find it easy to just pop a pin in because you can line the handle up with it. Now, make sure the bottom edge of the handle is level with the bottom edge of the bag. And then the right hand side, so the outer edge of the handle, is level with that 4.5 inches mark. Exactly the same as you did the other side, but just make sure that the right hand side is level. And then that means that the handles will be, the ends of the handles will be positioned 4.5 inches in, and then pin it together at the top as well. You can place some extra pins in now if you want. I just find I put them in to get the placement right, and then I'll put more pins in because I'm going to be sewing this strap into place. So put as many pins as you think you need to hold it nice and steady. And if you've put webbing inside, the webbing is slightly narrower than the handle, so you can actually just pin into the fabric of the handle. Now, in the same way as before, measure and mark 4.5 inches down from the top and draw a little line, and measure and mark 1.5 inches below that. And take your ruler and draw horizontal lines across the strap. That's why a heat erasable pen is really useful here, because after you've done all the stitching, you can just iron it and the marks will disappear. Now you're ready to sew the handles into place. So what you do is you start at the bottom, the left bottom, sew up to the top, stitch up to the top, across, down, stitch across, up, down, and then back down the other side, and then do the same on the left. Start at the left, go up to that. So that leaves the top bit looped. Now repeat this to attach the other handle to the bag back outer in exactly the same way, using exactly the same measurements. Preparing the bag zip. Take the bag zip. I've put using a double slider zip. You can use a single slider if you prefer. It just depends on how you want your bag to open. Now trim the end off. I've got a continuous zip, so you can see mine is sewn across, but if you've got a zip with a metal or plastic end, just trim the end of that off. It just reduces the bulk and gives you a nice neat end to start with. Now take your zip tab outer and place it right sides facing on top of the zip, making sure that the zip is placed centrally underneath and that the raw edge of the zip tape meets up with the raw edge of the zip tab outer. And just pin that into place. Place your pins vertically for that. Now take one of the zip tabs lining and place it underneath the zip tab outer so that the zip is sandwiched between. Match up the raw long and short edges of the zip tab outer and the zip tab lining, and the zip will be central between them. And then place some pins through all the layers. You can reposition those pins if you want to pin through all the layers there. And then sew through all 3 layers using your 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure you stitch slowly when you hit the zip teeth, just so your needle doesn't break. Now fold the zip tab outer and the lining outwards away from the zip so that the raw edges match, and just give that a quick press, and that will just make sure that the seam on the outer and the lining are on the edge. Make sure that the raw edges are matching up and just pin them together. Now top stitch along that end and tack along the top. And then it will look like this. So the top stitching gives it a neat finish. The tacking holds the ends together. Make sure the tacking is worked within the seam allowance. And then trim off the ends of the zip tabs so that they are level with the edges of the zip tape. And now the ends of your zip are very neatly enclosed inside those tabs, which makes your zip easier to insert and gives you a neater finish. Now, before you put the next zip tab on the other end, you need to measure along your zip. The measurements for this are given in the instructions, so measure very carefully. You might need to move the sliders out of the way just so that you know that you've measured it exactly, and mark that measurement onto the zip tape. I'm just going to pop a pin in to start with. That's just a bit easier. And then I've marked that measurement at the top and the bottom edge. Making sure the sliders are in the centre of the zip, cut through the zip tape and teeth along that mark. It's really important that you do it exactly on that mark so that it will fit your bag. Now take another zip tab outer and lining and repeat this process. You can do it either way. I'm putting the zip tab lining wrong sides up with the zip right sides up on top. And I'm just going to anchor that with some pins and then take the zip tab outer and put it on top. It doesn't really matter which way you do it, as long as you are sandwiching the zip between the 2 pieces. And if you've used a print fabric instead of a plain fabric, the tab and the outer need to be right sides facing. And then sew them together along that edge and then snip the sides as before. Inserting the zip. Now you've attached the handles, it's time to put the zip on. So place the bag front outer right sides up, making sure that you've got the handle facing downwards. Take your bag zip, the one that you've got the zip tabs attached to, and place it right sides down on the long edge and pin it into place. Now, because you measured exactly the zip when you put the tabs on, and also because you cut your bag front outer to size after you'd quilted it, then these will fit exactly, and you will have much nicer finish, and your zip will be nice and neat. So match up the raw edge of the bag front outer with the top edge of the zip tape and pin it into place all the way along. The sliders will distort it slightly, it just pulls it a little bit out of shape. So when I get to the slider or sliders, just move them out of the way and then you continue pinning. But if you've pinned it at either end first, then you know it's going to fit nicely. Then once you've done that, you can tack it into place within the seam allowance, so just about 1/8 of an inch for the edge, and that holds that zip nice and firmly and securely in place. Now take the bag front lining and place that right side down on top. So placing the top edge of the bag front lining, match up the top and the side raw edges of the bag front outer so that you're sandwiching the zip in between. I always like to put another pin down the side, and that just holds it just steadily in place, and then pin the lining to the other side, matching up the top and side raw edges. And again, if you put a bit pin further down, it just holds it steady while you're stitching. And now you can pin the lining to the zip and the outer, and the zip will be sandwiched between. Make sure you move the lining so that the raw edges are matching up exactly, and then everything will fit nicely. I'm just adjusting it as I go along. So once it's pinned in place, stitch this into place using a zip foot, 1/4 inch of the edge, and stitch all the way along, and then it will look like this. So now if you open out the lining and then adjust it, just place it so that the lining and the outer are wrong sides facing. You just want the lining and the outer out of the way while you sew the other side onto the other, because you don't want to get caught in the next seam. So just make sure they're both facing downwards. Now take the bag back outer, again, make sure the handles are facing downwards and you've got the top edge of the back outer. And then take your zip that you've got the front outer attached to and place it right sides down on top. And we're going to sew this into place in exactly the same way as we did with the front outer. So match up that zip tab with the top and side edges. And you can pin it into place a bit further down, and that will actually hold that lining from the front lining out of the way. I'm just going to move my sliders to the centre and then match up the top and the side raw edge, and then pull it down a little bit and just pin it into place down the side. That pin you can take out later, it just keeps it steady. And just as you did before, pin the zip to the outer, making sure that the edge of the zip tape matches up exactly with the raw edge of the back outer. And pin it into place all the way along. This method of tacking the zip in place before you sew the lining in place makes it a lot easier because things don't slip out of place, and it's just a quick tacking stitch. I'm going to move those sliders out of the way again, only because, particularly with a double slider zip, it does just make a little bump in the zip and makes it a little bit harder to sew. Once you've pinned it into place, you can tack it back without moving the sliders. It's just the pinning process. And now tack this into place inside the seam allowance, so about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and it will look like this. Now take the bag back lining and place that right sides down on top. So this is the one with the pocket on, so you can see, make sure it's right sides down on top so you can see that pocket uppermost, because the pocket you can see on the wrong side, and pin it into place. Obviously you might have decided to put a pocket in both the front lining and the back lining, and then you'll see them on both sides, but that's just an optional thing that you can do if you prefer. Now for this one, I am going to move my sliders just while I'm pinning this into place, because you've got all these layers together, and because the front is attached, it sometimes can move everything. So it's very easy to just pop your hand inside to move them. And then once that's all pinned into place, using your zip foot, sew those 3 layers together. And then it will look like this. So you've now got the zip sewn between the front and back outer and the front and back lining. So the next thing you need to do is place it so it's lining side up and pull the lining away from the zip. If you just smooth it out like this, what you're aiming for is for that seam to be laying right on the edge, and then turn it over to the outer side and again pull it, move those handles out of the way, and press it so the seam lies right on the edge of the outer and the lining. It's worth turning it over a couple of times just to make sure everything is laying flat on the outer and the lining, and then to hold it in place, top stitch down both sides about 1/8 of an inch away from the zip. So it looks like this. So you can see that line of top stitching. It gives a nice neat edge, and if I show you the other side, it holds the lining inside the bag as well and stops it getting caught in the zip. And then you can see the zip opens nicely, nothing's caught inside, and you've now neatly inserted a zip. Stitching the base seams. You need to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance for these base seams. It's the only place you do it, but it makes the bag bottom a little stronger. Now take the bag front outer and the bag back outer, move the lining out of the way, you don't want to be stitching into that at this stage, and place the bottom edges right sides facing. The bottoms of the handles will match up. You've placed them in the same place, but just make sure that they match up, and what I do is just match them up and then I pin either side of them. So if you just place a pin, they are in the same place, but just in case anything's moved, I would just match them up like this. Just roll the bottom of one handle on top of the other. It just means that when you see the base of your bag, the 2 handles will meet at the bottom and just give a neater finish. And then pin it together all the way along. Put in as many pins as you think you're going to need. You can, if you like, take the time, because you obviously made this with charm squares, to match up the charm square seams as well, just for a neater finish. Then sew it together, remember, with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then it will look like this. Now press that seam open and flat, just to give us flatter bottom on the base of your bag. So do take the time to do that now. It's much easier to do it now than later. Now we're going to sew the base seam to the lining. So take the front lining and the back lining and place those right sides facing along the base seam. This is a bit easier because you haven't got anything to match up, and also you haven't got the stabilizer, so it's just a bit easier to sew together. And then pin it together all the way along. Now you need to leave a turning gap in this seam, and it needs to be an 8-inch turning gap, so it's big enough to turn the whole bag right sides out through later. So if you take your tape measure, measure halfway along, and then if you measure 4 inches either side of that centre mark, then you will have an 8-inch turning gap. This is the only place in the bag where you turn it right sides out. I've designed the bag so that it's the only place where you will have to turn it right sides out. Now stitch either side of that turning gap. So you stitch 2 seams, not forgetting to reverse stitch, and then press that seam open as well so that it's nice and flat. And there's your turning gap, and also the edge of the turning gap are folded under. Attaching the bag ends. So take your joined bag outer. We now need to match some quarter points because we're going to put those circular ends in the sides. So take the base seam at the bottom and place it right sides facing along the zip tee, so the centre of that tab. Place a pin in the centre of that tab, and then place the base seam onto it. We're just trying to mark the quarter points, so those are the 2 halfway points, the seam and that tab. So just fold it in half and pop a pin at that end, because we're going to divide this open end of the bag, side end, into 4. So that's another quarter point. and then place the seam and that pin back together again. And then just match the raw edges so that you can find where the fold is, and that's the 4th quarter point. So just push that pin in. Because we're going to put the circular bag in here, it's easier if you divide it into 4 so that you can make sure the circular end is in correctly. So we've got 4 points now. And then repeat that to mark the quarter points on the other end. I've done those in advance. They're done in exactly the same way. Now take one of your bag ends. If it's got a specific way up, then make sure that you mark the quarter point so you have it the right way up or facing the right direction. So I'm going to fold my circular end in half and then put a pin at the bottom of that fold and then a pin at the bottom of the other fold. If you've just got one print and the direction doesn't matter, then don't worry. But if you do have a directional print, then do make sure that that halfway point is exactly halfway along the print. And then once you've got those pins in, fold it in half again, match up those pins, those 2 halfway point pins, and then just make sure the raw edges match so you've got it exactly folded in half. Pop a pin on that side and then put a pin on the other side. And now you've divided this circular bag end into 4, which means when you pin and sew it to the bag, you're just working on 1 quarter at a time, which is a lot easier. If you've got a top to the outer to the bag end, then do mark which the top is so you make sure you put it in the right way. So, and then do the same with the other bag end, divide it into quarters. Now take your bag and your bag end. If you've got a top, pin that to the top of where the zip tab is. So you can see here, because I've got a top, I'm placing that top pin right sides facing with the top on the zip tab. Now pin it together at the next quarter point. So take the quarter point pin on the circular bag end and your quarter point pin on the side of your bag and pin them together. Then pin them together at the other quarter point on the circular end, and this time on the base seam, because that's your another quarter point. And then finally match up those last 2 quarter points. So now you've anchored it in 4 places, which means that you will put it in correctly. Now all you need to do is pin it together between each of these 4 points. Fold the lining out of the way. You don't want to pin or sew into the lining, because when you sew it together, you're going to be leaving a little gap where the zip tab is. This just makes it neater, and then it is also a way of not having any bound edges inside your bag, and it being very neat inside. And this is the method I'm going to show you to do it. So your bag will be just as neat inside as it is outside. So make sure as you're going round, you match up the raw edges and pin it together, and it will fit. And also, because it's quite a big circle and a big bag end, it's very easy to adjust it to fit. It's harder when they're small circles. With the bigger ones, it's easier to adjust. So I've pinned it between the 2 quarter points. Repeat that to pin it between each of the quarter points, and then it will look like this. So it's pinned together all the way round. Now you need to sew it. Now you need to sew just outside of there, so don't sew into the zip tab or the lining at all. So where I'm putting that pin, that's where you need to sew all the way around, and then stop stitching just before that fabric that side. So you will have a little gap, bit of a gap unstitched, just about here. And then it will look like this. So you can see that seam, I've sewn it all the way around, and there's where I'm putting my finger, there's a little gap. Don't worry, we will be sewing that together later. Then repeat that to sew the other bag end to the other end of the bag. Again, matching quarter points, pinning, and then sewing it and leaving that little gap where the zip tab is unstitched. So you can take out all of the pins now. Now we're going to repeat that to sew the bag lining ends into the bag lining sides. I've marked all my quarter points already in exactly the same way, folding it in half. I've marked the quarter points on the bag end lining pieces, so there you can see there's the 4 quarter points. And there's the 4 quarter points on those 2 ends. Now take one of your lining ends and pin the lining into place in exactly the same way, so that making sure that your lining and your end lining and your main body lining are right sides facing. Match up the pins. So the first pin I'm matching up to the pin that's on the zip tab. Now I'll be pinning into the outer at this stage, but after this, it's only just because that pin is on the zip tab. Only pin into the lining, because the way that we make sure that your bag is just as neat inside as it is outside is you sew the outer and the lining totally separately. And then the lining will sit free from the bag. And I'm going to show you a technique in a moment of how to join them together. But at the moment, the outer is sewn to its ends and the lining is sewn to its ends. So don't sew them together at all. So match up all of the 4 points. And then when you've done that, you can then pin them together between those 4 points. And again, just like with the outer, don't sew into the outer at all, only the lining. So where I'm putting this pin here, that's where you need to start sewing. And then pin it together between the 2 quarter points. And it will ease quite nicely, because it's all been calculated so that the circle fits in. If you get to the other pin and you find you've got a little tuck or a little pleat, just go back and adjust the pin slightly, and it's quite easy to get it to fit. So that's 1 quarter pinned. Repeat that to pin between each of the quarter points, remembering only to pin into the lining. And it will look like this once it's all pinned. So you can see I've eased it all the way around, and then on the other end, I've stopped pinning the other side. So start stitching here, work all the way around and stop stitching just here, right by the outer, but not into the outer, leaving that gap unstitched. And then once it's done, it will look like this, just like the outer does. You've sewn the bag lining end into the bag lining, and there's that little gap. And then do that on the other end. I've done that one in advance. There's the other end. You've got the outer lining. You've got the lining, main body lining, and the body side end all pinned together. Right, now we're going to close up those little gaps. And this is really easy because they fit exactly. So just pin the outer and the lining together. So this is the bit where we're going to sew them together, and then we'll sew them together a little bit more later. But this is the one section where they're attached, but this does mean that you won't see any bound or seams or raw edges inside your bag. So what you need to do is just pin them together across that gap and then stitch them. Make sure that's flat on that side, and then stitch them together, but start stitching about 1/2 inch from the end of the seam all the way along, and then 1/2 inch onto that seam. If you overlap the seam slightly, it'll be a bit more secure, and then it will look like this. So you can see the gap is closed, the lining is stitched to the outer, and then you can do that at the other end. You can sew up the gap at the other end in exactly the same way. So hopefully by being able to see it here in the video, you can see how I've done that. So now you've really neatly attached your bag ends, and I'm going to show you how to finish it off. Finishing the bag ends. Now this step is optional, but will hold your lining nicely inside your bag. So you can see here where we've sewn the lining to the outer, just on the zip ends. Pin now the lining to the outer. So you can see I'm following the seams of the circles, so the bag end circles, I'm pinning them in place. This is going to hold the lining really neatly inside your bag so it doesn't bag out, and also will give your bag more structure. If you find this a bit fiddly at all, you don't have to do it. Everything will still stay inside your bag, but it just gives a nicer finish. So just follow those seams round so that the round seam on the outer end and the round seam on the lining end, you're just pinning together. Make sure that the raw edges match up. That's really important, because the seam that we're going to sew to hold them together is going to be sewn inside the seam allowance, so that it won't be seen from the inside and won't affect the structure of the bag. So pin it into place all the way round until you get to the base seam. So what you can do is you can keep pinning all the way around, or you can pin the base seam together and then pin between. It's important that you keep the outer and the lining flat so that you don't get any of the other fabric caught in it. So now I'm going to match up the base seam. So the base seam of the outer and the base seam of the lining, because that's where we're going to stop stitching. So just pin those together. And then you can then pin back to it. I just find that it's a bit easier just to make sure that everything's laying nice and flat. When I get about a quarter of the way round, I then pin it to the bag end. So as you're doing it, just keep checking that the two fabric, all the fabric layers, because you've got 4 fabric layers there, just make sure that they're laying flat and you haven't caught any of the extra fabric whilst you're pinning. And then I'll put a final pin just in there. Now you need to sew it together, but sew inside the seam allowance. So you're only going to be sewing about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And this will just hold the lining onto the inside, and then stop stitching when you get to that seam. So you're only stitching half a circle. So now you can you see that extra line of stitching? It's inside the seam allowance, so about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And I've sewn all the way around and stopped at the base seam. Now we're going to do the same on the other side. But you can't, this time, you can't sew all the way around. If you do, you won't be able to turn your bag right sides out. It just won't work. So what you do this time is you just pin them together a quarter of the way round. So half the way round the half circle. You don't need to measure that, just guess it really. About a quarter of the way round. If you go all the way round, the bag won't turn right sides out. But this is enough to hold the lining to the inside so that when you open your bag, the lining stays put. It doesn't start coming out. And it's just an alternative way of finishing a bag, because sometimes bags are made where the inside seams are bound to hold them together. But I prefer my bags to have the lining and the outer quite separate. I think it just makes the bag neater on the inside. So you have to sort of fold it and twist it round a bit, because obviously you're trying to sew 2 pieces together in a bit of a backwards way. But if you just keep following the seams round, match up the raw edges, then you will find it goes together quite easily. And if you want, you can mark the halfway point before you start doing this. So you can see about halfway. So that section there, I'm not going to stitch. That will be left undone. So again, stitch inside the seam allowance, and it will look like this now. So you can see that extra seam. So you've sewn about 3/4 of the circle, and that bit's left unstitched. Now repeat that on the other end of the bag. You have to do one end at a time. And then it will look like this. It looks a bit twisted and a bit strange, but it will work. You've just got to sew 3/4 of the way round on both of them. So once that's all done, we're ready now to start turning our bag the right way out. Finishing the bag. So take your bag and find the turning gap that you left in the base lining and turn the whole bag right sides out through that gap. It's a nice big gap that you've left, so it's reasonably easy to do. So just push everything through, and then you'll see how it's all worked where you've sewn the linings to the ends. So on the inside, you can see you've got a nice neat lining. If you just push out all the ends, you can't see those seams that you've sewn, the last ones that you did to join it, but you've got nice neat seams on the inside, and the lining is then independent of the outer, and you get a really nice finish. So pull it all out and just check that everything looks okay, because you can always turn it right sides out again if you've got any little tucks or creases. But so just check all the seams look nice and neat, and then you just need to turn the closing gap. So if it's come unfolded at all, then just press it back into place and then pin the gap closed. Make sure the edges of the turning gap stay pressed under. Press it again if not, and then match up those edges and pin them together. It's always worth checking to make sure all your seams on the outside and the inside look nice and neat and you haven't caught any extra bits in it before you sew this up. And this is the only section where you will have this gap. And then I like to machine stitch that across, just makes it nice and secure, and then it looks like this. So there's your gap, turning gap closed. There's the lining, you can see you've got your pocket. So you just need to turn your bag right sides out and put your hands in to just push out all of those seams that are on the bag ends. And then put your hand in the other side and just push out all the seams. You can press them if you like. If you lay the circle flat on your ironing board, you can press them. And your bag is now finished. So with your double slider zip, you can close it and put the sliders in the middle. It's got nice long handles, so you can pop them over your shoulders. There's those lovely quilted bag ends. And obviously, if you've got any directional prints, you've got them facing the right way up. And you've got a really nice quilted bag that's perfect to take on a weekend away. Making the shoulder pad. This is a little accessory you can add to your bag to keep the straps together. Place the shoulder pad outer and the shoulder pad lining charm square, right sides facing, and pin together, making sure you match up the raw edges all the way round. If you want to make your shoulder pad a little bit more padded, you could put some wadding beneath one of these if you like. You could cut a piece of wadding to the same size. I've just done mine with a piece of fabric because I wanted mine mainly to hold the straps together. Now you need to leave a turning gap, so you can turn this right sides out. So mark a 1 inch turning gap in the centre of the bottom edge. Make sure it's in the centre. And then sew it together all the way around, leaving that turning gap unstitched. Actually, it's a 2 inch turning gap, I've just realised. 2 inch turning gap in the bottom edge. You could leave a 1 inch turning gap if you like, it's just a bit easier to turn out with a 2 inch turning gap. Now cut off the corners, don't cut through the stitches, and then just trim a little bit either side of it. That just reduces the bulk and in the corners and you'll get a neater edge. So trim off the corner and then a little bit either side, and then you'll get nice, neat, pointy corners. When that's done, you need to just press one side of the seam. So just fold over one side and give it a press. And this will help when you turn it right sides out to make sure that the seam lays right on the edge. It's harder to get the seam to lay on the edge if you don't press this over. So just press one side of the seam allowance over. And do that all the way round. And then when you get to the bottom edge with the turning gap, press that seam over and then just turn it over and press it on the other side. It's just so that the edges of the turning gap on both sides are turned under. It's easier to sew them together later. And once you've done that, you can turn this little shoulder pad right sides out. And obviously, if you've put wadding in it, then that will then be on the inside. But that's entirely up to you. It depends if you want to use it to pad the shoulder, whether you want them to hold them together. And then just poke out those corners. Do it gently because you don't want to split the stitches or the fabric. So push the fabric onto your point turner rather than the point turner into the corner. And then when that's done, make sure the turning gap edges are still folded under and give the whole thing a press, rolling the seams between your fingers to make sure the seams are right on the edge. Now top stitch all the way round, and that will hold the turning gap closed and also give it a neater finish. And then it will look like this. So it's just 2 squares sewn together. Now to make it into the little shoulder pad, you need to overlap one side. So overlap the top edge onto the bottom edge by 1 inch. So I'm just measuring 1 inch here. And then overlap that, so into a little tube. So if you overlap one on top of the other where it meets that pin, and then pin it, and then do that on the other side, then that's neatly overlapped by 1 inch. Now these overlapped edges need to be held together. You can do that using snap fasteners, press fasteners, whatever you want. I've used these little plastic cam snaps for mine, and I've just put 3, one in the centre of each of those little squares, or just place them evenly. So they'd see I've put 3 at the top, one half at the top and one half at the bottom. So then what you do is you get your bag, and then when you want to carry your bag and you want those straps to stay together, just overlap the straps, and because you've got that charm square in the middle, you know where the centre is, wrap the little shoulder pad around them, and that just makes it easier to carry. And then when you don't want them tied together because you want to open the bag, just unclip them and wrap them around just one handle, and that just gives your bag a little bit more of a professional finish. And that's it, your charming weekender is all good to go, and you're ready for a weekend away.